And so we're in our a cappella service study times, and I love doing these interactive drashes during this time when we can see each other. What do you think of this setup? Do you guys like it? Do you not like it? Circle this. It was sort of an experiment today. So anyways, so let's jump into our readings today. Today is kind of a unique Shabbat. It's called Shabbat Parah. And this is the Shabbat that immediately follows Purim. Wasn't Purim great last week? Yeah. It was amazing. It was wonderful. Yeah, absolutely. The Ruach Israel string ensemble and the wine and cheese, I mean, that was good. You know, the brass klezmer, the play, everybody. It was really wonderful, wonderful experience. And some of us were here since like 9:30 in the morning to 10:30 at night. You know, just out of the joy of like dwelling in the house of the Lord. You know, it's really wonderful. It's so cool, and that brings so much energy. Anyway, that's Purim. But this is a Shabbat that's part of a series that we start right after Purim to prepare for Pesach, to prepare for Passover. Now, the word parah, anyone know what parah means? Parah. Cow. It means, so this is the Shabbat of the cow. Okay? The Shabbat of the cow, specifically the red cow. The Shabbat of the red cow. Parah Aduma. And so in this passage, God instructs our people. We just read it, you know, right up here. It's kind of a weird passage. And there's this heifer that's taken, that's burnt down to ashes. And then what we do is we mix this strange concoction of cedar wood, hyssop. There's something that the Torah calls crimson stuff. We mix that in. And then we mix that with water. And then the Torah goes on to discuss how when a person comes into contact with a dead body, that person becomes ritually impure to go into the temple. Ritually impure and ritually clean are not categories of value, good and bad, like we think of clean and dirty, but they're categories of the appropriateness of a person going in the temple or not. So it's a different, all Jews are ritually impure today because we don't have a temple at all. Does that make sense? Okay, so you got to think differently about this category here. Anyway, so they were impure, and then what the priest does is he sprinkles this concoction on a person on day 3 and day 7, and then all's good. And that's what happens. So, and even more oddly, the priest who makes this concoction is made impure by his own concoction that he makes and has to go outside the camp for 7 days as well. And you know, so it's a whole process. There's a lot to do here. Again, halakhically speaking, the only reason why we don't do this today is because there's no temple, so there's no impurity. It's not relevant in the ritual sense, in the same idea. However, in modern Judaism today, we do care about contact with corpses, with dead people. And if you're a Kohen, you're actually still not allowed to go in a cemetery and not allowed to go near a dead body as a Kohen. And you can't do anything about it because there's no ritual to bring corpse cleanliness back in. So that you only need to think about it if you're a Kohen. Now, okay, so this is a really strange passage in the Torah. It's one of those awkward ones that you think we just, you know, like, can we just skip this one, please? We'll go on to the good stuff, you know. But then, no, not us. We take out a whole nother scroll and we read just that passage, you know. It's out of our reading cycle that we read this passage. So why? Why do we read this passage? What's with this? What does the red cow have to do with preparing for Pesach? Let's think about this. We have some runners. Andrew and Isaac are going to use mics. And we want to use mics if you have a comment, because otherwise the people on Zoom and YouTube are like, it's just quiet for like a minute or something like that. So just raise your hand if you have any thoughts. We'll do a little bit of interactive. And they'll run over to you with a mic and hold it for you so you can talk. What do you think? What is a red cow? What does this ritual have to do with preparing for Pesach? Any ideas? A cleansing? If it's just a one word, I'll repeat it. A cleansing. Okay, cleansing. Actually, that's one of the answers that the sages give. It's to remind us of the cleansing process that we would do if we were making the pilgrimage into Jerusalem in order to prepare for offering our lamb in the temple in Jerusalem. So that's part of it. That's good. Any other ideas? The concept of sacrifice before Pesach. Okay. That's interesting. Okay, well, so let's think about this. Let's let that question sort of frame our discussion, and we're going to go into different levels of this. So to our modern ears, this seems really weird. This whole ritual is very strange. But it wasn't just to our modern ears. Even ancient Jews considered this ritual to be really weird. And so there's a midrash which pictures King Solomon, who was the wisest man in the Torah. And he says, I have labored to understand God's word, and I have understood it all except for the ritual of the red cow. Okay, isn't that funny? Okay, so now rabbinical commentator Rambam explains that this commandment receives the most critique because it's performed outside of the temple rather than inside, so it's in view of everybody. So if you're going to pick one ritual that's going to be in view of all non-Jews, let's pick the ashes of the red cow. You know? Like, that's really nice. Well, okay. So what our sages do is they say, well, this is actually one of the most important commandments. Why is this the most important commandment? Don't take that too literally. It's not like undoing what Yeshua said about love your neighbor, and that's not it. But as one of the most important commandments, why might our sages have decided that this was one of the most important commandments? Any ideas? Barbara, we got a runner? Yeah.
Maybe because we can't do anything about death.
Ooh.
It's final. It's going to happen to everybody. We don't plan, but, we can be in the middle of our life, and a parent dies or a child dies, and we need to have a way of dealing with that.
Wow, you're very good. Sage Barbara. Okay, that's really good. Something about death. Let's think about that, and let's see where that goes. That's really good. Any other thoughts? Abby, right here.
We can't understand it fully.
Yes.
Which makes it so much more incomprehensible, which just shows God's holiness.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
You're good too. Sage Abby. You guys are amazing. Okay. Yes. These are really two of the reasons why this is the most important. There's a story in this is a story, a midrash about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He's a central figure in rabbinic Judaism, and following the destruction of the temple in 70. But this is a story about him before, and so a Gentile comes up to Rabbi Yochanan and says, "Okay, these rites that you carry out look like witchcraft. You bring a cow and you slaughter it, you burn it, you crush the remains, you take the dust, and one of you contracts corpse uncleanliness, you sprinkle it on him 2 or 3 times and say, you are clean." Okay. Rabbi Yochanan replied, "And have you ever seen someone into whom a wandering spirit has entered?" "Well, yes," the man replied. And the rabbi said, "Well, what do you do?" The man said, "People bring roots and smoke them under him and sprinkle water, and the spirit flees." Rabbi Yochanan said, "And your ears, do they not hear what your mouth speaks?" Okay. So Rabbi Yochanan brushes this man off. He says, "Listen, your rituals are just as weird as ours." That's what he says. But then his disciples come to him and say, no, that's not good enough for us. We don't want to be the same as the pagans. What's really going on? And Rabbi Yochanan says, "By your lives, it is not the corpse that imparts uncleanliness, nor the water that affects cleanliness, but it is a decree of the Holy One, blessed be He." And that's the difference. It's not about the ingredients. It's about God's command. And so the idea here is that there's no inherent uncleanliness that comes from touching a corpse. There's no inherent purifying agent in the ashes of a cow and how they're administered. It's like a witch's brew or a pagan's concoction. This is entirely different. It's all about the command of God. And so this is one of the reasons why the sages see this as the most important commandment, because it's pure in a sense. It's such a mystery that it requires love and trust and engagement to enter into that mystery. So there's another saying that the ashes of the red heifer is a commandment that is compared to a lover's kiss, which one cannot explain, but can only experience. Do you see? Now, I don't think we're referring to the ashes of the burnt cow as like the experience of seeing the ashes as this experience, but it's the experience of devotion and trust in God within the heart of a mystery when we lack understanding. That experience is like a lover's kiss. We can't explain it. Have any of you had that experience? When you trusted God for something when you couldn't see how he was working out the pieces, where it was going to go, what was going to happen. You couldn't see why he was asking you to do this thing or to not do this thing, and yet you trusted anyway. And then he meets you there, and there's an encounter with God that you can't explain. That's like the lover's kiss. This is the red heifer. The lover's kiss in the red heifer ritual is trust in the mystery of God's larger plans, even though we can't possibly understand them. Harry, runners.
This reminds me of Yeshua putting the mud on the blind man's eyes
Yes.
and telling him to go to the pool and wash. There's no reason.
There's no reason.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Except obedience.
The reason is obedience. Yes. And Naaman, when he was healed, the same idea. And he's like, I don't want to do this. But his servant's like, why don't you do it anyway? That's good. Can you think of other times? I mean, a lot of times Yeshua heals people. He requires an action, faith action to follow. Cheryl.
The woman with the issue of blood, it was really her, it was her faith that healed her, not the actual fringe, the tzitzit.
Right.
Well, that represented.
It represented so much, but still she came out and took this step that she did. That's right. Yeah. There's a lot in the healing stories. We could kind of go through them when he requires some act of obedience in us. And I think that's true for us. God requires acts of obedience because that's how we demonstrate trust in his life. And it isn't just about what God tells us spontaneously to go here or go here, or go to that grocery store or pray for this person and do that. That's all good, and we need to grow in that as a community. I really think so. It's also in the realm of the mitzvot that he gives us. Don't eat this particular food even though everyone else does. Why? We don't really know. It's not because the pig is like, or the horse or the whatever is like going to hurt you. It's not that. It has no inherent uncleanliness in it, but it's the command of God. He says to do this. We follow, and when we follow, we demonstrate this obedience and trust, even though it's a mystery to us. And there's all kinds of things in life like this. Okay, you guys, let's go a little deeper. So take that, because that's a really important lesson in and of itself. But let's ask this question. This is a neat idea that comes from one of the scholars at Aleph Beta, and I'm kind of incorporating this into the middle of our discussion because it's just so good. Why a red cow? Why a red cow? I mean, it could have been a goat, could have been any kind of other kosher animal. Why a red cow? Yeah.
Is a red heifer a milking cow by any chance? I don't know much about farming.
Well, that's a good question. I think so. Does anyone else know the answer to that? A heifer is just a cow, right? A bull would be male. That's right. Yeah, you know about cows. Okay.
I do know about cows. It's a story for another time. But I don't think so. I think it's a beef cow.
Oh.
I think it's a beef cow. And because red cows now are Hereford cows. I just wondered if those were rare cows, if it was a rare breed.
Could be kind of a rarity. What's that? She does know cows. Okay, we'll get that story at Oneg. Okay, Fred. I see Fred and Nick.
As for the red, there's a lot of red in this passage, red stuff, etc. I think it's to represent blood, because blood is what purifies. It's the detergent that gets rid of our sins.
Blood is a detergent. That's an interesting phrase. That's good. I'll have to think about that. Blood is a detergent. Okay. What's that? Yes. Okay, good. Fred, did you have a comment?
Yes. As to what you were saying, Rabbi Nathan, that the rabbinical understanding that if we follow God's commands, that it gives him pleasure. Nachas, that's the Jewish word for it. It gives him pleasure. He gets pleasure out of us obeying his commands. So, okay, red heifer, if we obey what he says, it gives him pleasure that we do so.
That's right. It really is. There is a pleasure component to that. And there's a pleasure component to following the Lord when you know he's calling you to do something and you do it. Or just, there's a pleasure when you observe the mitzvot, and you do it and you do it with your heart and it just feels good and you feel God's smile. That's good. So, okay, let's look at the word red. Red in Hebrew. What is red in Hebrew?
I was just curious.
Yeah.
Isn't the Hebrew word for red Edom, which ties to earth? So if you die, you go back to earth.
Okay, you're getting somewhere. We have another sage among us here. Okay, Adom. Adom is red. The vowel, the way that this word is in the Torah is aduma. Aduma. And so think about this, the letters. Aleph, Dalet, Mem, Hey. What word does that sound like? Adama. Adama is earth. But there's another word inside of here. What's the other word inside of here? Adam. What do you think? Adama. Oh, Adam. Adam comes from earth, the soil. That's why Adam is called Adam. That's right. So, Dam. Yes, Dam is blood. Blood. Okay, let's think about this. Blood. Now, that's interesting because the ritual, red is the color of blood, sort of. Crimson, dark color of red. And it's kind of neat that we have a red cow. But a red cow isn't just reddish, is it? Have you seen a picture of a red cow? It's actually brown. It's more like a brown reddish. So do you think that a red heifer kind of looks like a soil and blood mixed together? And the word itself has soil and blood mixed into it. The red. It's cool. So where else in the Torah do we hear about blood and soil mixed together? Yes, Cain. When Cain kills Abel. You guys remember the story? Cain is jealous of his favored brother. He takes him out into the field. He smashes him with a rock, or he strikes him somehow, and he kills him. And then God says, Cain, where is your brother? And Cain responds sarcastically, in a trite way, am I my brother's keeper? And then the Lord says, what have you done? Your brother's dam, his blood, cries out from the Adamah, from the ground. These two things come together. Okay, so Cain's murder of his brother is the first recorded death in the Torah. After Adam and Chava eat the fruit, death enters into the world. So what might this mean, that this ritual seems to point back, this ritual which cleanses us from death, from an encounter with death, seems to point back in the red heifer all the way to the first death in the Torah. Let's think about that. What might that mean? What are the implications of that? Barbara? Yes. Now, you're onto something. That was a murder. Now, a murder should be even more shocking, right? But what is Cain's response? There's no shock. It's the first it's the first death recorded, and it's a murder. He should be shocked. But he's not. And that's maybe part of it. Part of the consequence that he has. Any other thoughts? So there's a mystery. Be thinking about this. There's a mystery that's deeper than just not understanding the ritual, which is part of it. But I think that the ritual itself, this is what Barbara got at earlier, requires us to confront death. It requires us to confront death. And it requires us to never become numb to death in the world. Death is something that I think every person, on the planet, for the most part, unless we're at the one time when Yeshua is coming back or something like that, we all, death is awaiting us. And it's the mystery in the future that every person on the planet, regardless of class, regardless of wealth, regardless of success, regardless of friends, regardless of any of that things, we all have looming ahead of us, don't we? And I think that many people live a life where we kind of push that off. It's like we think about it, we try not to think about it until we're confronted with it at a funeral or at something like this, and then we're confronted with our own mortality and the mystery of death. What is that going to be like? What is it going to feel like? What happens in death? Dave?
What you're saying makes me think about how everyone involved in this ritual becomes unclean. And you might think that, well, Eleazar the Kohen, the priest, people can get unclean, but he's got to stay clean. Mm-hmm. But by participating in this ritual. And there's another unnamed pure person who has to be, the person who takes care of the ashes. There are at least 3 separate people involved in this. So it's like a person who encounters death and has to be cleansed. They don't do it on their own. Anyone who, by the nature of this ritual, at least 3 other people are brought into that kind of encounter with death with them and are also made impure for a certain amount of time.
Yes.
So it's a way of kind of accentuating, I think, that thing that you're saying, that death is a part of life, and that not only is it a part of life that's, in a sense, inescapable, but it's a part we have to encounter together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's beautiful. We have to encounter it together. And I think that in the Torah, see, sometimes in our world we like to sort of we normalize death, either by scary movies or by action movies where there's death all the time, our media, or even by celebrating it in some way as just this part of life. But I think it's missing something, because I don't think death is part of the original plan. And there's the scriptures, God hates death. And death is something that we should always be shocked by. Death should have an impact on us. And look at Cain's consequence. So Cain, his consequence for treating life so frivolously, is that a word? Is to wander. He's outside the camp. He's lonely. He's got to wander the rest of his life. And that word for wander for Cain is from the word nidah, which is also part of the red heifer experience. The ashes of the red heifer, the water, is called nidah for you. It is to be set aside for you so that you come to it in wandering, in being set apart. And so I wonder if when we come into contact with a corpse, we have to sort of participate in Cain's consequence for a time. Think about that. We have to participate in his consequence to bring us to the reality of death. Yes?
Sorry, I have something to go off of that
Okay,
for the
sure,
law of
yeah.
nidah. Yeah, so
Uh-huh.
when you're talking about the blood, I'm looking at Ezekiel when we read that, to me, there are ways where like the uncleanness of a woman in her monthly period, so I poured out my wrath on them for the blood that they had shed on the land. And I'm thinking of Cain and Abel when you said that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about like unredeemed blood. And somehow through, just my interpretation with the red heifer, that there is a redemption that needs to take place. So the other reading from Hebrews 9, when it says, how much more shall the blood of Mashiach through the everlasting Spirit offered himself unblemished to Elohim. So I think that there's like this very deep connection in that.
Yes, very good. Yes, we're headed in that direction. So very good. It's very good connecting the readings together. That's wonderful. Cheryl. Is Cheryl? Yeah.
Very active. I was just thinking that when you have an intimate experience with death, a spouse, someone very, very close, the only way is to make a place in your life for death. It's the only way. So you go through all these iterations of denying it, of going all through these phases of grief. But when you think about carrying that Torah and the joy of Torah, like we have to make a place for this in Torah as part of us embracing, loving, having joy over Torah. This has to, even though it's weird, as we say, it has to have its place. And it's very similar with death. You can't unsee death. That will not happen. Mm-hmm. So you have to come to a place where you find a way. It's a miracle through God's grace to find a place for death along with everything else.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking that maybe in this case, death represents our sin, which separates us from God. Uh-huh. And so the red heifer may represent Yeshua, and it's a special offering, which is a red heifer. That would be the Messiah, and only he can bridge that separation, and we come back to him.
Mm-hmm.
And
very interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Hold that thought. Let's see where that goes, because I think you guys are onto something here. Let's combine the first point and the second point. The ashes of the red heifer, it ritualizes a mystery that requires us to take death seriously, to never lose the horror and never lose the wrongness of death, by requiring us to go through this ritual, participate perhaps in Cain's wandering, separate apart, involving community. We all have to come together as a community experience to recover from the encounter with death. And then requires us to do something mysterious and beautiful, to trust God through the invisible, because it's something we can't possibly comprehend. Death is like the ultimate red heifer. We can't understand it. And we don't, no matter how much faith we have, no matter how much we understand Yeshua, like, I don't know, we don't know what that will be like, unless you're one of those people who have had near-death experiences, and then maybe you do. But in general, we don't know, and there's this mysterious, it's veiled. And so we have to trust God, complete trust in God for ourselves through these mysteries. Now, I think that sometimes people live life sort of like on a board game. You imagine a board game and the goal is to advance to the next step in whatever vector of life you're in, whatever place you're in. And imagine like a Monopoly game, I got to get to free parking and I got to get more hotels. And, this is the life that we live in, and death is like falling off the board. The mystery that we never want to encounter, and some people bury their heads down and just live on the game. In the CIS, you probably know people like this. So the ashes of the red heifer require that we encounter death and then have this encounter with God where we have to trust the non-materialist things of the world. We have to trust God with what's off the board. And then we have to come back from that, back onto the board, still within the same rules of the game. We're still following the same rules. Our routines and our rhythms of life might look very similar, but our whole objective, our whole priority, and the whole mission of life is changed. And no longer are we just living for free parking or living for the hotel. If you keep with the analogy, now we're living for God's greater purposes within the game, which is veiled in mystery. You see, we're living to trust and to serve God who's outside of the game. He's the one who made the game in the first place. And that's very important for us as Messianic Jews, to be set aside, set apart, to be able to serve him in life. And the ashes of the red heifer, I think, realize this in our life. Now let's just jump to close. We'll close with this. The Hebrews 9 passage that you talked about. It's so amazing that we connect this with the ashes of the red heifer, and that's why we actually read it today. We read, "But when Messiah appeared as the Kohen Gadol, the high priest of good things that have now come, passing through a greater and more perfect tent not made with hands," that is not to say of this creation, "he entered into the Holy of Holies once and for all, not by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls," get this, "and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, sanctify the cleansing of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse our conscience from dead works to serve the living God?" So, what does the writer of Hebrews, why does he highlight the ashes of the red heifer above all the other things? Why does he highlight this? It's because the ashes of the red heifer are part of God's plan to undo death, to undo the death that Cain started in the first place. And so he highlights this particular ritual to bring it in, to understand who Yeshua really is. And Hebrews is making this kol v'chomer argument. It's like a rabbinic style of writing. How much more so? And so the idea is that we have this earthly Mishkan, this earthly temple that's supposed to be a replica of the heavenly throne room of God. It's a replica. And if the ashes of the red heifer actually does cleanse a person from being defiled by death so they can re-enter God's presence in the temple and re-enter life with Israel, he's not saying it didn't have any effect. He says it actually did that to affect a person, a change in status within the temple. If that actually had an effect, how much more so does Yeshua's own blood, with a sacrifice not of, we get into this, the high priest of Aaron, but of Melchizedek, a whole different kind of mysterious priesthood, where he makes his sacrifice not in the earthly Holy of Holies, but in the heavenly Holy of Holies. establishing a path into the kingdom of heaven and cleansing us from these dead works. Now, the dead works are not like mitzvot, or they're not like works righteousness. That's not what he's getting at all. He's saying cleansing us from the materialist living, from being on that board game. Cleanse us from living for all of the wrong things and instead leading us into serving the living God. Because it isn't just that we say, yes, I trust you for your sacrifice. That's not what this passage says. It says he cleanses us to serve him and to live a life that follows his ways. So this is the greatest mystery of all. You know, when we trust in Messiah Yeshua, we're rescued from the entire experience of death entirely. And Yeshua says this in John. He says, though you die, you shall never die. And we're brought into his resurrection and brought into his life and participate in his resurrected life in the kingdom of heaven. It's beautiful. So, you know, we celebrate this, and this brings us all the way back to our first question. Why do we read about the red heifer in preparation for Passover? And maybe now it becomes clear, because just as we're about to relive the miraculous birth of the Jewish people through plagues and through the splitting of the sea and through the death of the lamb covering us from the firstborn from death, we read about the red heifer that reminds us of this same mysterious space between life and death. And this mysterious divine kiss, where the only thing that becomes important is to trust God to carry us through the parting sea. So it reminds us to not wait. You see, we don't need to wait until we encounter death from others, or we don't need to wait until we encounter our own death. And we don't need to wait until we sit down at the Seder table to relive the story of the Exodus, but we can do this now. We can live lives that will serve him now. So with that, a Shabbat Shalom. Great discussion. You guys did awesome. And let's close our service. If I could invite Shana up, we will close with the Aleinu on page 93.